Back on the Newsfeed PM. Thanks for staying on. In recent months, U.S. President Trump has imposed tariffs on foreign goods, claiming they will boost American manufacturing and protect jobs. Critics warn that the move could raise prices for U.S. consumers and disrupt the global economy. In late May, a U.S. trade court ruled Trump lacked the authority to impose the tariffs, but an appeals court quickly allowed them to remain in place pending further litigation. To unpack this further, we are joined now by Dr. Laurence Caromba, a researcher at Mistra. Good to have you, Doc, and thank you very much for your time. Is the President of the United States fast learning that tariffs are not as easy to use as he thought they would be?
Well, you know, the Trump administration's policy has been back and forth on the tariffs, you know, before this current legal dispute even began. I think just based on the economic fundamentals, you know, as you said, the inevitable effect of introducing tariffs into the United States would be to push up the cost of goods. You know, that's how tariffs work. You make things that are imported more expensive so that you can try to incentivize domestic production. So even when tariffs are working correctly, they work by making things more expensive, and that's not popular with business, and it's not popular with voters. And so we have seen this policy, you know, shift back and forth. You know, the continual putting tariffs in place and then removing them again, and this, you know, this climate of unpredictability.
What complications does this bring to the global economy?
It creates very significant complications for the global economy because it makes it difficult for businesses or governments or even individual people to plan rationally. You know, most companies that sell physical goods in the modern economy have some sort of global supply chain, right? Like, it's quite rare to have goods that are completely produced in only one country. So, you know, as supply chains crisscross around the world, you know, they cross national borders. And, you know, if governments start to impose tariffs when they cross them, then that pushes up the price of every subsequent thing in that, you know, every subsequent step in that supply chain. So any product that crosses into the United States at some point, if the US is putting up these tariffs, then becomes more expensive. But then if other countries put in place counter tariffs in response to the US, then that, you know, further creates added costs, deadweight loss to the economy. And then, you know, on top of all of that, we have this policy uncertainty. So now it becomes not just about, you know, okay, like, let's say we know there's a 25% tariff and maybe our business model is still viable, but then, you know, maybe next week it'll be a 50% tariff or 100% tariff. You know, the rates are changing so quickly that it becomes difficult for anyone to engage in rational economic planning.
Yeah. Whatever happens, I mean, does this process likely going to force Trump to fundamentally rethink his economic agenda, which he had promised for so many years that he will put in place?
So that's interesting because there's lots of uncertainties here, right? So what's happening has been that Trump has been imposing his tariffs using an American law that basically it's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, right? Which essentially says that the president is allowed to unilaterally impose tariffs in the case of a national security crisis. And, you know, this has been used over the decades by basically most U.S. presidents for the last 30, 40 years, but usually in response to some sort of national security crisis, you know, when there's wars, in response to terrorism or drug trafficking, then U.S. presidents have imposed like narrow tariffs against particular countries that they're trying to target. There's never been a case before where a U.S. government has tried to use these kind of temporary emergency powers to impose broad, sweeping, possibly permanent tariffs against basically the entire world, right? And it certainly seems to me, I mean, I'm not an expert on U.S. trade law, but it seems to me unlikely that that was what was intended. So the first question is now the U.S. court, the lower court, has essentially said that Trump can't do this, right, and that he's essentially he's trying to behave like a king or a dictator, but that it's really up to Congress, the American legislature, to choose what these tariffs are set at. Now, a higher court has said that while this dispute is happening, the tariffs can still remain in place. So the tariff policy is continuing for now, but there does seem to be a significant a significant legal challenge to whether it is actually okay to just have a single person who can kind of make these decisions with no oversight, no checks and balances, no input from the legislature, and just push tariffs up, up and down one day to the next. It seems, it seems like that might be questionable whether Trump actually has those powers in the long run.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem to bother him much, because on Friday it seems he would have been at a rally and made an announcement that he is going to look at a surprise plan to double the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminium, in a move that seemingly has caught the UK on the back foot. Is this largely going to jeopardize the UK's zero tariff deal with the US?
Possibly. Look, the steel and aluminium tariffs are separate from this issue with the emergency powers. So that's like a separate set of tariffs that Trump made under a different set of legal authorities. So what he's doing essentially is to say, well, if a court is going to block me from imposing tariffs through one mechanism, I'll do it through another mechanism, but I will have tariffs. And it might be the case that countries like the UK in this case can end up as kind of collateral damage of wrangling between the court system and the executive in the US. I will note, though, that, there is like an obvious way that Trump could pass these tariffs that bypasses this whole legal question, which is he could simply pass legislation through the US Congress to just do this through law. And his political party, the Republican Party, controls, they control the lower house of representatives, they control the upper house, the US Senate, obviously they control the presidency, so they control, they control all the branches of government. And there's no real reason why they couldn't do this, which kind of raises the interesting question of why is Trump operating through these kind of extraordinary legal powers rather than just passing legislation, which is the normal way of running a government.
Yeah. Now, as you say, if he manages to do that, this, of course, increases costs, as you've mentioned, for consumers and businesses on both sides of the Atlantic, if you like. Where does it put a country like South Africa? What does it mean for us when the price of doing business in the United States or even in the UK goes up?
Yeah. So, first of all, to state the obvious, Trump's tariff policies are harmful to South African interests, because what it means is that every South African business that exports goods to the United States suddenly has a much more difficult time of doing so. And while the US is not our largest export partner, they are very high up there, and they are a major export destination for a lot of our high-value goods, finished goods, manufactured goods, as opposed to things like raw materials. So that's not good for South Africa. If the court system in the United States is pushing back against Trump's tariff policies, then in a sense that is good for South Africa, right? It shows that there are domestic actors within the US that are, like I said, pushing back against government policy in a way that's beneficial for South African interests. that strengthens our negotiating position to some degree. But that said, I would also say that we as a nation should probably not be relying on this, right? Like we shouldn't be relying on US courts or US lawsuits to save our position. We really still do need to be trying to negotiate a bilateral trade deal with the United States. And that is what our government has been trying to do. You know, we saw them travel. We saw the president travel to Washington, D.C. as part of that effort. And, you know, I think we need to keep trying to do that regardless.
Dr. Laurence, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. That's Dr. Laurence Caromba, researcher at Mistra there on the Trump tariffs. The Newsfeed PM continues in a moment. Stay with us.